The signal came in at 0217 station time, and I almost missed it. I was on my third cup of terrible coffee, staring at a console that had shown me nothing but static and routine navigation pings for the past 6 hours. Relay Station Kepler 9 was not exactly the most exciting posting in the human fleet. It was a tin can-vaulted to a rock 3 light years from the nearest human colony, staffed by 4 people and a water recycler that groaned every time it ran a cycle. My name is Maravos, and on that night, I was the only one awake. The signal hit the receiver array and immediately triggered 3 separate alert tones at once. I sat up so fast I knocked my coffee off the console. The liquid floated in a slow arc in the low gravity, and I did not even watch it. My eyes were locked on the screen. 17 languages. The signal was encoded in 17 different alien languages, simultaneously layered on top of each other like someone had grabbed every translator they could find and screamed into all of them at the same time. The computer was working hard to sort through it, stripping layers, flagging priority phrases. I leaned forward and read what it had pulled out. The Valara home world was under siege. I had heard of the Valara. Most people in the relay service had. They were a quiet species, old and gentle, known mostly for their architecture and their music. They had no real military to speak of. They had never needed one, mostly because they had nothing anyone wanted badly enough to start a war over, except apparently now they did. The aggressor was the Krath Dominion. My stomach went cold when I read that name. The Krath were not simply a hostile species. They were a force of eraser. In the past 200 years, they had ended 4 civilizations completely. Not conquered them, ended them. The Conclave had issued 17 formal protests. The Syndicate had imposed trade restrictions. The choir had composed a very sorrowful piece of music about it. None of that had ever stopped the craft from doing exactly what they intended to do. The computer finished its analysis and gave me the critical data in a single line at the bottom of the screen. Estimated time to complete destruction of the Valara homeworld: 38 hours. I checked the signal routing history. Next, it had not come directly to us. The Valara had broadcast it wide across every frequency they could reach to every receiving station in a 12-light-year radius. That meant the Conclave had it, the Syndicate had it, the choir had it. Every major power in this region of the galaxy had received this exact distress call at roughly the same time we had. I pulled up the response logs. The Conclave's automated system had already flagged it as, quote, non-actionable at this time. The Syndicate had routed it to a subcommittee that would not meet for 9 days. The choir had not responded at all, which was actually their way of saying no. I sat there for exactly 4 seconds. Then I opened a priority channel to Central Command. I want to be clear about something. I was a staff sergeant running a relay station in deep space. I was not an officer. I was not a decision-maker. In the normal flow of military procedure, my job was to log the signal, file the appropriate report, flag it for review, and let the people above my rank handle what came next. That was the correct process. That was what the handbook said. I did not care about any of that right then. I flagged the signal at the highest priority level the system allowed, which was a code I had technically never been authorized to use on my own. Then I opened the channel and started talking. Admiral Claire. Harmon picked up in 4 minutes. I know people who have waited 4 days for a return call from Central Command on routine matters. 4 minutes for a staff sergeant at a remote relay station in the middle of the night on a channel she had no formal authority to open at that priority level was not normal. It told me something had already been moving before I called. Her voice was calm. Not the calm of someone who had just woken up. The calm of someone who had been awake for a while and had already been thinking. Voss, you have the Vithara signal. Yes, Admiral. 17-language broadcast received at 2:17. Kraraf Dominion siege confirmed. I have an estimated 38 hours before the situation becomes unreoverable. There was a pause of maybe 2 seconds. I heard her typing. The other powers non-actionable across the board. Admiral Conclave Syndicate Choir. Nobody is moving. Another 2 seconds. Voss, I want you to pull every piece of data you have on craft fleet movements in that sector for the past 90 days and push it to my terminal, right? Now. Full packet. Do not compress it. Yes. Admiral sending now. I heard more typing. Then another voice in the background. Mail lower, giving rapid numbers, fleet coordinates, fuel states, readiness levels. I realized with a feeling that was somewhere between pride and disbelief that the conversation at the other end of that channel was not about whether to respond, was already about how her voice came back. You did the right thing, opening this channel. Log everything you have, timestamp it all, and stay at your console. You are going to be very busy in the next hour. She was not wrong. The first movement order came through 19 minutes later. Not a small patrol group, not a reconnaissance flight. 47 warships, 200 support vessels, 12,000 Marines, all redirecting from their current postings to a staging point at the edge of craft-adjacent space. The mobilization code attached to the order was one I had read about in training, but never seen used in a real operation. Protocol Omega. It meant every available asset, maximum urgency, no waiting for permission from anyone who was not already in the chain of command. I started logging the movement confirmations as they came in, ship after ship responding within minutes, captains pulling their crews from rest cycles, from shore leave, from maintenance holds. Nobody asked why. The order came with the Valara signal attached, and that was apparently enough. At one point, around 0330 station time, I got a secondary alert from the Conclave monitoring relay that our station also tracked. Their observers had picked up the human fleet mobilization on long-range sensors and were attempting to hail Central Command for an explanation. The hail was logged and filed. Nobody at Central Command responded to it right away. They were busy. I sat at that console for 4 more hours without leaving my seat. Routed data packets, confirmed signal relays, logged coordinates, and tracked the growing shape of what was assembling in the dark between stars. The other 3 people on Kepler 9 woke up one by one and came to the main room. Drawn by the alert tones and the unusual activity on every console at once, and they stood behind me and watched the screens and did not say much. One of them, a young technician named Owen Price, stood at my shoulder for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly, "Do you think they can actually make it in time?" I looked at the fleet mobilization screen. I looked at the distance. I looked at the 38-hour clock ticking down in the corner of my display. I think I said that they are, going to try very hard. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nobody else tried at all. I did not answer that because there was nothing useful to add to it. It was simply true." The Conclave, with its vast resources and its ancient authority, had filed a report. The Syndicate had scheduled a meeting. The choir had been silent. And somewhere out in the dark, 47 human warships were already accelerating. I thought about the Valara. I had looked them up in the station database while I was waiting for the Admiral to respond. They were a tall species, thin-limbed with large eyes adapted for low light. They built their cities into the sides of cliffs, curving structures that looked in the photographs. Like something between a cathedral and a seashell, their music was famous across 12 star systems. One of their composers had written a piece that was considered a landmark of galactic culture, something even the choir acknowledged as extraordinary. In 38 hours, all of that was going to be gone. Unless a group of humans who had been asleep 2 hours ago could push their ships fast enough to get there in time. I refreshed the mobilization screen. More confirmations coming in. The fleet was taking shape. The Conclave's hail request was still sitting unanswered in the log. Blinking patiently, I looked at it for a moment. Then I went back to routing data packets because that was my job, and there was a lot of it to do. At 06:12, Admiral Harmon sent a short message directly to my station console, not through the standard routing system. It was 4 Words. Good work, Sergeant Voss. I saved it. I do not know exactly why. I just felt like it was going to matter later. Outside the station viewport, the stars were the same as they always were, cold and distant and completely indifferent. But somewhere out there between those points of light, something was moving. 47 ships, 12,000 people, all of them heading toward a world that had never heard of them to help a species that had no idea they were coming. The galaxy had called it non-actionable. We called it Tuesday. Captain Idris Grant had been running the Assissus Relentless for 6 years, and in that time he had learned one thing above everything else. The ship always told you when it was being pushed too hard. It had a sound, a low cycling vibration that came up through the floor plating and into the soles of your feet if you were paying close enough attention. His engineers called it singing. Idris called it a warning. The Relentless was singing very loudly. "Drive output at 114%, said his chief engineer, Pauline Webb, from the doorway of the bridge. She had grease on her hands and a look on her for face that was professionally neutral in the way that people are professionally neutral when they are actually extremely concerned. Rated maximum is 95. We have been above rated maximum for 11 hours. I know Idris said the secondary coolant loop on Drive 3 is running warm. I know that too." Pauline looked at him for a moment with a specific expression of an engineer who has said something that she needs the other person to understand. Completely. "I want to make sure you know what I mean when I say warm, sir. I do not mean slightly elevated. I mean, if it goes 2 degrees higher, we are going to have a serious conversation about whether that drive keeps running at all. How long can you hold it at current output?" She thought about it, not performing thought, actually thinking. He appreciated that about her. She never gave him an answer before she had one. "If I pull 2 people off the forward array and put them on manual coolant cycling, I can probably buy us another 8 hours before I have to make a hard call about whether to reduce output or risk the drive casing." "Then do that." She nodded and left without another word. Idris turned back to the nav display and looked at the numbers he had been looking at for the past several hours. Distance to the Valara system, current speed, estimated arrival time against the window before the CR siege reached the point where nothing could reverse what had been done. The math was close. It was very, very close. He had 19 hours. Designed to overwhelm planetary defenses through sustained pressure rather than quick strikes. Their ships were large, heavily shielded, and built for endurance over speed. They were not flexible. What they were historically was inevitable. Every species that had faced them described the experience the same way in their own languages. Different words that all pointed at the same image, something that kept coming no matter what you did. The intelligence files contained engagement records from every species that had ever faced the Krath. The reading was not encouraging. Most species had either surrendered before significant engagement or had fought and been worn down over months until they simply had nothing left. A few had achieved defensive actions, holding specific positions long enough to negotiate terms. None of them, in 200 years of documented encounters, had ever driven the Krath away from a committed siege. Not once Idris read that last part 3 times. Then he closed the file and pulled up his own tactical notes instead. At 9 Landry ship time, Andre, his communications officer, a young lieutenant named Frances Cole, looked up from her station with an expression that mixed professional composure with something that was clearly difficult to keep contained. "Sir, we are being hailed by the Conclave Ambassador's vessel, Ambassador Preva's ship. He has been attempting contact for the 40 minutes, and his offices is flagging it as urgent. Put it through." The screen opened to the image of Ambassador Preva, a tall, gray-feathered Avari who served as one of the Conclave's senior representatives in this region. He had a measured voice, the kind of voice that had spent decades being the most reasonable sound in any room. Right now, It was doing its best to remain that way. Captain Grant, I am glad you responded. I want you to understand that what I am about to say comes from genuine concern for your people and for stability in this sector. Ambassador, your fleet's current heading takes you directly into craft-controlled space. What you are doing constitutes a violation of the Interstellar Non-Aggression Compact, specifically Articles 7 through 11, which prohibit unilateral military action in contested zones without conclave authorization. I have to formally advise you that proceeding will result in a conclave censure of Earth and potentially far more serious consequences. Idris looked at him for a moment. He was aware that Francis behind him had gone very still in the way junior officers go still when they are watching something they are going to remember. Ambassador Idris said, I appreciate you taking the time to contact us. Captain, I need a commitment that you will alter course. I have 47 ships, 12,000 crew, and a Marine complement running at maximum FTL toward a species that sent a distress signal 41 hours ago and has not sent another one since. Either they found a solution, or they are running out of people who can operate a transmitter. I know which one my instincts say it is. File whatever you need to file. We will discuss it after. Preetha's expression did not change exactly, but something shifted around the eyes. After what, Captain? After we are done. There was a pause. Then Prethva said quietly, You understand that the Krath will view this as an act of war. The Krath are currently in the process of ending a civilization. I think we are past the point of worrying about how they feel about things. He closed the channel. Francis made a sound she probably did not intend to make out loud. A short breath that almost became a word. And then she very carefully returned to her console. Idris turned to his first officer, Gordon Ash, who had been standing at the tactical station and was now wearing the expression of someone who had just watched something happen that they would be telling people about later. Gordon, full battle analysis on the craft formations. Every weakness, every gap, every moment in 200 years where someone landed a hit that hurt them. Presented to all senior officers at 1400. Yes, sir. And Pauline on the drive situation every hour. Yes, sir. The briefing at 1400 was the most focused session Idris had ever run. 12 senior staff crowded around the tactical table, going through enemy engagement records with the attention of people who understood that the numbers they were reviewing were not history. They were a preview of what was waiting for them. Lieutenant Commander Owen Briggs, his tactical officer, had prepared a thorough breakdown. Owen was meticulous in a way that occasionally tested patience, but in moments like this was simply the most valuable quality in the room. The craft use a formation there. Doctrine calls the hammer and wall, Owen said, pulling up a three-dimensional diagram. Roughly 60% of their fleet maintains constant pressure on the planetary defense systems. The remaining 40% positions as a blocking force. In every recorded engagement, they commit the hammer formation early and hold it fixed. They do not rotate their ships. They do not redeploy mid-siege. Their entire doctrine assumes the opposing force is defending from inside the engagement zone, not approaching from outside. They are not built for counter-assault. What happens when someone hits the hammer from outside? Idris asked. No documented cases. Silence around the table, Gordon said. None. Every species that has ever faced a craft siege was already inside the zone when engagement began or attempted negotiation before fighting. Nobody has ever arrived from outside and attacked the hammer formation directly. There is no established response for it in their tactical doctrine. Idris studied the diagram. Their command ships, where are they positioned? Owen indicated a cluster near the center here, protected by multiple defensive layers, extremely difficult to reach by conventional approach. What about unconventional? Owen looked at him carefully, then understanding moved across his face. Marine boarding action, sir. Is there a path? Owen studied the diagram for a long moment. Several people around the table were doing quiet calculations. running the scenario against what they knew. The craft have never been boarded. Their internal defense systems are built to prevent occupants from breaking out, not to stop a small armed unit from breaking in. If Marines could get a drop craft through the outer layers during the chaos of a direct assault on the Hammer, the command ship's internal defenses would be the least prepared point in the entire fleet. Idris nodded slowly. Find me the path. The engineering reports kept coming in through the afternoon. At 1700, Pauline appeared on his console, looking the way she always looked when she had news. That was the kind of news you needed to hear but would not enjoy. Drive 3. The secondary coolant loop gave out completely. We are on manual circulation. I have 2 people on it right now. Can we hold speed for now? If the manual team keeps pace, maybe another 10 to 12 hours at current output. After that, the heat buildup becomes a structural question. A pause. Sir, I want you to know that both engineers volunteered for manual cycling. I did not assign them. They knew what it involved and they asked to go. Idris took a breath. Manual coolant work on an active drive system was brutal in heat and physical demand. Tell them I said thank you. Yes, sir? He reviewed the fleet status at 231 of his 47 ships were showing elevated stress indicators. 6 were running on partial engine capacity after failures their engineering teams had managed to work around and without fully repairing, which was the kind of creative engineering that made fleet commanders simultaneously proud and nervous. 2 ships were running on drives their own maintenance logs said should have been taken offline 3 weeks ago for scheduled service. Every single one of them was holding formation. No one had fallen behind. No one had reduced to safe speed, he wrote in his personal log that night, day 2 of the approach. The fleet is holding together through engineering skill and what I can only describe as collective refusal to slow down. We have 17 hours to arrival. The conclave has filed a formal protest that I have not read. Preva hailed again at 1800 to inform us that the craft have issued a warning to all approaching human vessels. Turn around or face engagement. Gordon suggested we send a formal reply. I told him our arrival would serve as our reply. He set down the recorder. Somewhere ahead of them, past the dark between stars, a world was waiting. It did not know they were coming. It had sent its signal into the silence, expecting nothing. Because nothing was what the silence always returned. If its people were still alive, they were probably preparing in the way that people prepare when preparation is all that is left to them. Idris thought about that for a time. Then he went back to the bridge because there was work to do and because sitting alone thinking about things he could not change was not something he could afford. At 0300 ship time, one of the 2 engineers on manual coolant cycling, a young woman named Alice Dunn, lost her footing on a heat-slick panel and took a serious burn across her left arm and shoulder. She was treated in the medical bay by the ship's doctor, a practical man named Paul Greer, who stabilized the injury and then watched her insist on returning to her station. He let her go because he recognized the look on her face, which was the look of someone who had made a decision that was not open to discussion. Idris went to see her. She was sitting at the coolant monitoring station with her arm wrapped, watching pressure readings with complete focus. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Drive 3 is holding optimal pressure, sir," she said, which was not the answer to the question he had asked and was entirely the right answer to give. He left her to it. At 0530, Gordon Ash came to find him in the tactical planning room where Idris had been working since 0200. Maps and projections spread across the table in the overlapping annotated way that planning looks when it has been going on for hours and keeps revising itself. "You should see this, sir." Idris followed him to the bridge. The forward sensor array was showing something it had not shown earlier, a signal pattern originating from the Valara system. Very faint, very intermittent, but there they are still. "Transmitting," Frances said from her station. Her voice was careful the way voices are when they are carrying something that matters. It is not the full distress signal. It is a repeater, automatic, probably running on backup power. But the home world is still broadcasting. Idris looked at the signal indicator for a moment. How long until they would notice us on their long-range sensors? Francis checked. At current approach speed, approximately 40 minutes. Good. He thought about what it would mean for someone on that world to look at their sensors and see something coming toward them that was not Krath. He thought about what 40 minutes of that knowledge might be worth to someone who had been spending their time preparing for the end. Make sure we are visible. Full transponder broadcast. I want them to know exactly who is coming. Francis opened her mouth to note that full transponder meant the Krath would also know exactly who was coming. And then she closed it again because, of course, that was already known and was clearly not a factor in the decision. Yes, sir. At 0600, with 11 hours left on the clock and the Valara system finally crossing from long range into standard sensor range, the fleet came out of the deepest phase of the FTL burn, and Idris Grant got his first clear look at what they were heading into. 9-2 CRT warships. He sat in his command chair and looked at the sensor display for a long, quiet moment. Behind him, the bridge crew was absorbing the same numbers he was absorbing. He heard the very controlled sound of someone on a nearby station breathing slowly, managing their response the way trained people manage responses they cannot afford to show in full. The hammer and wall formation was exactly as Owen Briggs had described it. The hammer, the siege line, pressed close to the planet in a curved arrangement that maximized sustained fire coverage against the surface and the orbital defense platforms, most of which appeared to have already been reduced. The wall, the blocking force, was positioned in a wide arc behind the hammer, angled to intercept any conventional approach from outside the system. The conventional approach would have brought the human fleet in through the wall, engaging the blocking force first, grinding through it, hoping to reach the hammer before the home world below ran out of time. Idris had no intention of making the conventional approach. He pulled up the tactical projection that Owen had refined overnight and looked at the numbers one final time. The angles, the windows, the specific points in the hammer formation, where the defensive coverage had gaps, not large ones, but gaps that existed because the craft had built this formation to resist pressure from within and had not designed the coverage for an external assault, hitting it from behind. Gordon tactical projection to all fleet captains, full briefing packet. They have 15 minutes to review and confirm. Yes, sir. While the captains read, Idris walked the bridge once. He did not say anything in particular to anyone. He just walked it looking at the people at their stations, the navigators and the weapons officers and the communications team and the engineers monitoring the drive systems that had been singing their warning song for the past day and a half. They looked back at him when he passed. Some of them nodded. Some of them had the kind of focus that goes inward and does not need external acknowledgement. All of them were exactly where they needed to be. He stopped at Alice Dunn's station. She was not technically a bridge crew member. She had been pulled up from engineering to monitor the coolant systems directly because the situation with Drive 3 made it necessary to have someone who understood its specific condition on the bridge rather than 3 decks below. Her arm was still wrapped. She was watching her instruments, Alice Idris said. She looked up. When we get home, he said, take the time off. She looked at him for a moment. Then something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to it. Yes, sir. He finished the walk and returned to his chair. The confirmation signals came in from the fleet captains over the next 12 minutes. 43 confirmations. One captain on a vessel running on a partially failed drive requested a modified position in the formation that would compensate for his reduced acceleration capability. Idris approved it and moved 2 other ships to cover the adjustment. Two more captains sent brief personal messages rather than just confirmation codes. He read them and did not respond to them because there was nothing to add and because people who were doing what they were doing did not need his words right now. The silence that came before this kind of moment had a specific quality that Idris had learned to recognize over 22 years of command. It was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of everything having been said and decided and prepared as much as it could be prepared, and the only thing remaining being the doing of it. Gordon Idris said, "Battle stations all ships." "Yes, sir." "Tell the fleet captains I want their tactical channels. Open from this point. Tell the Marine commanders their window is going to be narrow, and they need to be ready to move the moment we create a gap. Tell every engineering team in the fleet that I need their ships holding speed formation for at least the next 4 hours, regardless of what the indicators say." "Yes, sir." "And Gordon, sir." Idris looked at the sensor display. 9 ships arranged in their formation, positioned between his fleet and a world that had sent a signal into the silence and had somehow, against everything the history of the galaxy suggested was possible, gotten an answer. "Tell them we are here." The drop craft was shaking hard enough that Sergeant Taluya could feel it in her back teeth. She had made 17 combat drops in her care career and had been told by people she generally trusted that the shaking was normal, and that the sounds the hull made during entry were normal, and that the entire experience of sitting in a metal box being thrown at a planet while the enemy tried to intercept it was survivable. She believed all of that in the part of her mind that processed information calmly. The rest of her mind was paying close attention to the sounds the hull was making. 2 minutes, said the pilot, Corporal Ray Holt, who had the useful ability to sound completely bored during situations that were objectively not boring. Tali looked down the interior of the craft at her unit. 30 Marines in full combat gear, weapons secured, faces doing the various things that faces do when people are about to go somewhere dangerous. She saw calm. She saw focus. She saw a few people moving their lips very slightly in the private way that people talk to someone who is not in the room. She had briefed them 40 minutes earlier aboard the Relentless while the fleet was still closing on the craft formation. She had kept it short because long briefings before a drop were not useful. People took the key points, and their minds wandered for everything else. The craft flagship is Target 1. It is positioned in the center of the Hammer Formation, protected by approximately 40 support ships. "Captain, Grant's attack plan will hit the outer formation with everything we have to create chaos in their command structure. During that window, we go in. Our job is to reach the command bridge and make it clear to whoever is in charge that this siege is over today." Someone at the back had asked the obvious question. What if they do not want to stop? Tali had looked at them steadily. "We will be persuasive." The fleet had hit the craft formation with complete commitment and no warning feint. Idris Grant's plan had been aggressive to the point where it had no precedent, which was exactly the point. The craft's tactical doctrine assumed that any arriving force would probe and test and look for weak points, the way every opponent in their recorded history had done. The human fleet had done something for which no craft tactical protocol existed. It had aimed directly at the command cluster at full speed, with all weapons at maximum output and no pause between arrival and engagement. The craft outer formation had begun to respond, but the response was slow and disorganized because the commanders were looking at a situation that matched no pattern in their collective experience. The confusion had lasted only a few minutes, but minutes were the margin everything depended on. Tali's craft and 7 others had gone through the gap while it was still open. Now the flagship hall was 30 seconds away. "Everyone up," Tali said. The Marines stood, weapons ready, feet braced, reading the craft and each other, and the sounds coming through the hull with the automatic attention of people who have done this before. The craft hit the flagship's hull with a sound like a very large door slamming, and the mag locks took hold, and the cutting tool started, and then it was time. The inside of the craft flagship was built for larger beings. The ceilings were high, the corridors wide, the gravity running heavier than standard, the lighting was dim, the air carried the smell of metal and heat. The internal layout had defensive logic to it, but the logic had been designed for a different threat than the one now moving through it. The craft crew they encountered were formidable. They were larger than humans by a significant margin, physically powerful, and they did not stop. Most opponents in Tally's experience reached a point in a fight where they calculated whether continuing was worthwhile. The craft seemed not to perform this calculation. They continued until they could not. Her unit had to match that. In a narrow corridor, the only direction available was forward, and her Marines understood this without needing to be told. She watched them work in the tight, close quarters, way that the corridor demanded, and felt underneath all the noise and urgency something that she recognized as the particular kind of pride that had nothing to do with herself. They were doing something that had never been done before, in conditions that training simulations had only partially prepared them for, and they were doing it correctly. 90 minutes after breaching the hull, they reached the outer. Approach to the command bridge. Tali called a hold in a wide junction, got everyone into cover, ran a quick status check. 2 Marines were not with them anymore. 4 others were carrying injuries they had not mentioned until she asked directly. She looked at each of them. She asked the question that commanders ask in moments like this. Can you still do this? All 4 said yes. She believed them. She pulled out the fleet communications unit and tried to raise the Relentless. The signal fought through the hull interference and gave her fragments. She understood enough to know that the battle outside was ongoing, that the fleet was holding, that the outer formation was breaking apart, but had not fully withdrawn. She caught Captain Grant's voice briefly through the static. Something about the next 20 minutes. She put the comm unit away. 20 minutes, she could work with that. The approach to the command bridge had one final obstacle, a reinforced position with a guard setup that had no clever solution. She looked at it for a moment, considered the options, and then did the straightforward thing because sometimes the straightforward thing was the only thing there was. They went through it. The craft flagship's command bridge was a large circular room with tiered sensor arrays and approximately 30 crew members at their stations, and one figure at the center for that dominated the room the way that certain presences dominate rooms without needing to do anything specific. The fleet commander was tall, even by craft standards. Gray-scaled, broad chest, marked with symbols that the intelligence files had described as conquest markers, each one representing a world. There were a great many of them. The room went still when Tali's unit came through the door. Nobody moved. Tali looked at the commander. The commander looked at her. The air in the room was the kind of air that a held breath leaves, where the next thing that happens will set the shape of everything after it. The commander spoke. The translation unit on Tali's suit processed the words with a slight delay. You are very far from your territory, small creature. Tali considered several responses. She chose the most direct one. So are you a pause? Then the commander's next words came through. What you are doing will not save them. The outcome is already determined. Leave now, and we will consider your species' interference and error in judgment, rather than a formal declaration. Tali set her weapon down on the nearest console, not surrendering it, just putting it down to free her hands. She pulled out the communications unit and opened a line to the Relentless. Sir, I have the craft fleet commander in front of me. I have a message I would like you to deliver. Idris Grant's voice came back slightly strained from whatever was happening outside the hull, but clear. Go ahead. The commander is offering a conditional withdrawal in exchange for continuation of the siege. I need your response for the record. A pause of 2, maybe 3 seconds. Tell them we will leave when the Valara are safe. Not before. Tali looked at the fleet commander and delivered the words clearly. the translation unit running in real time. She had expected another offer, a counter, a threat. What she had not expected was silence. Not the silence of thinking, but the deeper silence of someone confronting a situation that sits outside all of their established categories. The Craft doctrine, built over 2 centuries of successful campaigns, assumed there was always a threshold where an opposing force accepted the reality of the situation. It was a reasonable assumption. It had been correct every time until right now. The silence stretched. Then it was interrupted by a change in the vibration of the ship. Something arriving through the hull from outside. A shift in the sounds and frequencies that even Tali, who could not read a Sulgrath sensor display, could feel as a change in the room's energy. She watched the crew. She could not read their instruments, but she could read their bodies. Something outside had changed. The human fleet had broken through the inner formation. She learned the full picture later. Idris told her back aboard the Relentless, with the adrenaline settling, that the breakthrough had cost 4 ships and that every surviving vessel in the fleet was showing damage indicators in some form. He told her that the 7 other Marine units had achieved their objective depth throughout the Crow formation, reaching key coordination nodes and disrupting the centralized command structure that held 900 ships together as a single tactical unit. Once that coordination broke, individual craft captains had begun making independent decisions. Craft doctrine had been built entirely around centralized command. It had no framework for what happened when the center stopped giving orders that made sense. The craft had started withdrawing at 1400 hours. The engagement from the moment the human fleet dropped out of FTL to the moment the craft siege line collapsed had lasted less than 6 hours. No species in 200 years had achieved this. No fleet of this rig's relative size had ever forced a craft withdrawal from a committed engagement. Idris Grant did not say any of this out loud. He was not the type. Tali, standing on the command bridge of the Craft flagship when the withdrawal signal went through the enemy fleet, watched the commander's face as the sensor arrays showed 900 ships pulling back from the world they had been positioned to destroy. The marks of conquest on that chest had been earned across decades, worlds reduced to symbols. The commander stood very still and watched his fleet withdraw, and then looked at Tali with an expression she could not fully read, because alien faces require years of familiarity to read correctly, and she had known this one for under 2 hours. But there was something in the complete stillness of it that she thought, without being certain, looked like the first moment in a very long time that something had needed to be fundamentally recalculated. "You will have consequences for this." The commander said probably. Tali agreed. "Your fleet is leaving. My unit will leave your ship once it is clear of the Valara system. If anyone attempts to prevent our departure, we will make that complicated. After we are gone, file whatever you need to file." She picked up her weapon from the console, holding it the way a person holds a tool they might need, but currently do not. Nobody tried to stop them from leaving. The 8 drop craft reassembled at the extraction point on the exterior hull of the flagship, mag locked and waiting while the craft fleet outside finished its withdrawal. The process took longer than Tali had expected. 900 ships do not move quickly when they are disorganized, and the craft were disorganized in a way that she gathered from the few translated communications fragments her unit had intercepted was genuinely new to them. There were arguments happening between craft commanders that had no precedent in their communication protocols. She listened to fragments of it without understanding the language, and understood the tone, which was the tone of people who have encountered something that their experience has not prepared them for and are not certain how to categorize it. She sat on the exterior hull of the craft flagship with her unit around her helmets, on the cold of space held back by the suits, and watched the Valara homeworld on the visual display built into her faceplate. From this distance, it was a sphere, blue and gray and patched with the brown of its continents. with the specific kind of atmosphere haze that habitable worlds had when you looked at them from orbit. It looked intact. From here, she could not see the damage the knew was on the surface, the collapsed structures, and the craters from orbital strikes and the long scars that siege weapons left in the terrain. From here, it looked like a world that was just there. She thought that was worth something. Her communications officer, a quiet young corporal named Nina Dawes, had been monitoring the fleet frequency throughout the wait and now reported that the last craft vessel had cleared the designated safety boundary. The flagship's own engines had powered up, beginning a slow withdrawal that would take it out of the system over the next several hours. "We have clearance," Na said. "Relentless is sending extraction craft now. Estimated arrival 14 minutes. "Good." Tali looked down the row of Marines seated along the hull. They were a mixed state, which was what you expected after what they had just been through. Some of them were very still in the careful way that people are still when they are managing something they will deal with later. Some of them were talking in the low, direct way that soldiers talk after an action, factual and compressed, not performing normally, but genuinely returning to it through the act of conversation. She did not try to manage any of it. They knew what they had done. They knew what it had cost. They would carry it the way soldiers carry things, which is not by setting it down, but by learning to carry the weight without letting it change your balance. She thought about the 2 Marines she had gone in with, who were not coming out. Their names were private: Clint Norris and Specialist Donna Page. She had known Clint for 3 years and Donna for 8 months. She had written the preliminary reports on both of them during the wait on the hull in the compressed military language that such reports required, and she had felt the inadequacy of that language very acutely while writing it, as she always did. Military language was precise and useful for many things. It was not the right tool for the specific task of describing a person. The extraction craft arrived on time, and they went home. Aboard the relentless Idris Grant met her in the landing bay. He did not make a speech, which she appreciated. He shook her hand, looked at her for a moment, and said, "Good work." Then he told her that the medical bay had 3 stations reserved for her unit and asked her to make sure everyone went through regardless of what they said about being fine. She did. She went through herself last. Paul Greer, who had the particular bedside manner of someone who had been a military doctor long enough to be efficient without being cold, patched 2 things on her that she had not been entirely certain about, and told her to sleep. She did not argue. She lay in her bunk in the quiet of the Relentless, making its slower return journey, and Clear's throat thought about the command bridge of the Krath flagship. She thought about the moment of silence after she had delivered Idris Grant's message, when the fleet commander had stood very still looking at her with that expression she could not fully read. She thought about the marks of conquest on that chest. She thought about a world that was still there. At some point she slept and did not dream. And when she woke, the Relentless was still moving through the dark, and the stars outside the viewport were the same stars they had always been. And somewhere below them, on a world she had never seen from the surface, people she had never met were beginning to understand that the end had not come after all. She thought that was enough for one operation. She went to find some food because she had not eaten in an unusually long time, and because soldiers understand that the practical work of taking care of yourself is part of the work of being able to continue doing everything else. The mess was quiet. A few other Marines from various units were there, eating with a focused appetite of people who have recently exerted a great deal of energy. Someone had apparently convinced the ship's cook to make something that was not the standard nutritional ration, and there was a tray of actual food on the counter. "The Admiral wanted me to tell you that the after-action report on the boarding action is going to be the most read document at command for the next several years, probably. Tally said he also wanted me to tell you that Specialist Page and Private Norris are going to be formally commended. He is writing the citations himself." She nodded. She did not say anything to that because there was not anything appropriate to say. Not right now. Not in the mess over a tray of food that was better than the standard ration. She would say it later. To the right people at the right time. Gordon finished his drink and left, and she went back to eating. And outside the mess viewport, the stars moved in the slow way that stars move when you are in transit and paying attention to them. And the Valara homeworld was behind them now, but still there, which was the thing that mattered most. She filed that thought away beside the others she intended to keep. I do not know how to begin this account in a way that will make sense to those who were not there. I will try. My name is Surath. I am an elder speaker of the Valora, which means I am the keeper of our records, the one whose responsibility is to observe and remember and speak truly about what has happened. I am giving this account to the Interstellar Conclave in formal session because I have been asked to describe the events that your people are calling the relief of. I will describe them as accurately as I can. Whether those listening understand what I am describing is a separate matter and not one I have full control over. When the craft siege began, we had already sent every distress signal available to us. We broadcast on all frequencies. We encoded the message in every language our archives contained. 17 in all, layered over each other, so that no species capable of receiving transmissions could miss the meaning. We did this not because we believed rescue was possible. We did it because it was the last action remaining to us, and our nature is to keep acting until action is no longer an option. We received acknowledgments. The Conclave's automated system responded within hours, which told us the signal had been received. We waited. Nothing came. The Syndicate's response arrived the following day. A formal note indicating the matter had been referred to a relevant review body. We waited. Nothing came. We did not hear from the choir at all, which we understood to mean what it always means when the choir is silent. We began preparing for the end in the way our people prepare for such things. There are rituals for this. There are songs that belong specifically to this moment. There are practical actions we take to ensure that the memory of what we were survives in some form, sent out in data packets toward the furthest reaches of our transmission range, against the very small chance that some other species someday might find them, and understand that we had existed and had built beautiful things and had tried. It is not a hopeful act. It is simply what we do. On the second day of the siege, at the 14th hour of our planetary cycle, our deep space monitoring team detected an anomaly in the outer system. The reading was initially unclear because the speed of approach was well outside the parameters our instruments were calibrated to measure. When they recalibrated, we understood what we were seeing. 47 warships moving at a velocity our engineers described in careful technical language as unsustainable for any known drive system. Our Defense Council debated this in approximately 4 minutes, which is very fast for us. The argument against it being a rescue was straightforward. No one had ever come before. The argument in favor was the sensor data itself. The ships were human. We had records on humans, not extensive ones, but enough to place them in our catalog of known civilizations. Humans were a young species. They had modest territorial holdings. Their military was competent, but not exceptional by galactic standards. They had no documented history of intervention in distant conflicts. They had no territorial interest in our system, no trade relationship with our people, no political reason to involve themselves in what was happening to us. Every analytical model we applied returned the same assessment. Rational behavior did not explain why they were here. They came anyway. I was in the lower city when the battle began. I had chosen to remain. Most of the elder speakers had gone to the mountain archives, which were the most defensible structures we had. But I had argued before the council that someone should stay in the lower city with the people, who could not leave or would not. There were many of them, the elderly, the very young, those who had decided that if the end was coming, they wanted to face it in their homes. I did not agree with this decision as a practical matter, but I understood it as a human decision, which is different from agreeing with it. Stayed because they stayed. I watched the battle from a rooftop. I am aware this sounds reckless. In the context of what was happening all around me, it seemed like a reasonable use of whatever time remained. The sky was full of the light of weapons at range, distant and abstract, in the way that a space battle looks from the surface of a planet. My understanding of military tactics is limited, but even I could see within the first hour that something in the pattern of lights above us was changing. The siege line was shifting. I had prepared myself for many things in the previous 38 hours. I had not prepared myself to watch the craft siege line shift because it did not shift. This was not an opinion or a hope. It was a documented fact that our archivists had presented to our council in a tone of sober and unsentimental resignation. The craft siege line was a fixed feature of our remaining time. And then, as I stood on that rooftop, it was not. I learned the details later. At the moment, I stood watching the sky. I only knew what the lights were telling me, and the lights were telling me that something unexpected was happening to the thing that was supposed to be inevitable. The first human medical team arrived on the surface before the battle was fully over. I want to be precise about this because I believe it matters to understanding who these people are. The craft outer formation had not completely withdrawn when a human medical transport, apparently indifferent to this fact, landed in the main plaza of the lower city and began unloading equipment. I walked down from the rooftop and went to see. There were 6 of them. They were shorter than I had expected. Our records on human physical dimensions were apparently not detailed enough to account for the variety within the species. And I had formed a mental image that was inaccurate in ways I did not fully understand until I was standing in front of one. They wore insignia that our database identified as medical service markings. 2 of them were already moving through the area around the landing site, assessing the injured, moving with the focused efficiency of people who have done difficult work in difficult conditions before and know how to not waste motion. I approached the team leader, a young woman with short dark hair and the kind of concentrated attention that leaves no space for anything that is not directly relevant to the task at hand. I did not know her language. She did not know mine. This was a significant obstacle. She resolved it in approximately 40 seconds. She produced a small device from her kit, directed it at me, and it played a phrase in the 3rd most common dialect. The pronunciation was imperfect but entirely understandable. "Where are you most seriously injured?" I told her she was already moving before I finished the sentence. Her name was Dr. Lucy Mercer. I found this out later. I also found out that she had been awake for 31 consecutive hours when she landed in my city. I found out that the translation device she had used had been programmed during the transit to our system, that someone in the fleet had spent time during those 2 frantic days of travel loading medical phrases in dialects into devices specifically for this moment. Someone had thought ahead. Someone had said, "When we arrive, we will need to talk to them." I did not know any of this yet. I only knew that they were there, and they were working, and that the city around me was not yet what I had been preparing myself for it to become. What I watched over the following hours is something I have described many times since. Each time I describe it, I am aware that language carries only part of what actually happened, and the part it does not carry may be the most important part. I will describe the facts and trust that some of what is between the facts will come through. They worked without pause. The 6-person team that arrived first was joined within 3 hours by more as human transport craft continued landing in the plaza, despite the ongoing activity in the upper atmosphere. They set up a treatment area in the open space beside the plaza, using structures they assembled from equipment carried from their ships, and they began working through the injured with the systematic focus of people who understand that limited time means limited choices about where to put your attention. They improvised. Our biology was not the same as theirs. Our physiology presented them with challenges that their training had not specifically prepared them for. I watched Dr. Mercer consult with a colleague over a patient whose injury pattern did not match anything in her reference materials, and I watched her make a decision based on first principles and careful observation. And I watched the decision work. She did not celebrate this. She moved to the next patient. There was one moment that I have returned to more times than any other, and I include it here because I believe it tells something true about these people that the military facts do not fully convey. In the rubble of a collapsed building near the southern edge of the lower city, a rescue team was working to reach survivors trapped beneath fallen structure. A human Marine, not medical personnel, one of the soldiers who had come down from orbit after the battle to assist with recovery work, was helping move debris alongside our own people. A young child, of our species, perhaps 4 cycles old, was found in a protected space beneath a collapsed wall. The child was alive. The immediate physical injuries were manageable, but the child's distress was severe enough that our healer said transport would be dangerous until the distress could be reduced. Because extreme distress in young Valara has specific physiological effects that complicate treatment. The child needed our healers set a stabilizing presence. The Marine sat down in the rubble and held the child's hand, not as a tactic, not as a calculated contribution to the operation. The Marine simply sat down in the dust and the broken stone and held a small hand and stayed there. And the presence itself was what the child needed, and the child's distress indicators began to stabilize within minutes. I watched this from nearby. I have thought about this image many times since that day. I have thought about what it means that a soldier in the aftermath of a battle they had just fought against odds that every rational analysis said they should not have overcome on a planet they had never visited among a species they had no prior relationship with. Found a frightened child in the rubble and sat down next to it. Not because it was efficient, not because it helped the larger operation, because a small creature was frightened and needed someone to stay. When I presented this account before the conclave, Ambassador Priava asked what the humans had requested in return for their intervention. I told him they had asked for nothing. He asked me to clarify whether I meant negotiations were not yet complete. I told him there were no negotiations. He asked me how I could be certain. I told him that Admiral Claire Harmon had met privately with our council and had been asked this question directly and had given an answer that our council had spent 3 days discussing because we could not determine whether we were interpreting it correctly. Someone needed help. The Admiral had said, "You sent a signal? We received it. This is what we do." Our council reviewed those words many times. The conclusion we kept reaching was the same. She meant exactly what she said. No subtext, no hidden condition, no deferred request. Someone had needed help. They had the ability to provide it, and so they had. Preva had no further questions at that point. I want to add one final observation that is not part of the formal testimony, but which I include because I believe it is true. In the days after the battle, I spent a great deal of time simply watching the humans who were still working in our cities. I watched them with each other. I watched them in the quiet moments between tasks, in the brief rests that people take when the work allows it. I tried to understand the thing that had brought 47 ships across deep space at speeds their own engineers described as unsafe. To help a species they had no prior connection to on the authority of nothing, except the fact that a signal had arrived and they had received it. I formed an impression. I do not claim it, is complete. Humans carry somewhere at the center of their nature, something that functions like an inability to leave a call for help unanswered. It is not a policy. It is not a strategy. It appears to be something older and more automatic than either of those things. When another living creature signals that it is in danger, something in humans begins to move toward it. The question of whether it is practical, whether it is politically sensible, Whether the odds are favorable seems to come after the movement has already started. There were other things I observed in those days that I include here because I believe they form part of the complete picture. I watched a group of human engineers working with our own technical staff to assess the structural damage to the lower city's foundation systems. They did not share a common language beyond what the translation devices could manage, which was adequate for basic technical communication, but did not cover nuance or precision. I watched them solve this problem through demonstration, through drawing, through the specific physical language of pointing at things and showing how they worked and watching to see if the other person understood. It took longer than it would have with shared language. They did not seem to find this frustrating. They seemed to find it, if anything, interesting. The way people find interesting a problem that requires a new kind of attention. I watched two human soldiers helping an elderly member of our community carry salvage belongings from a damaged building. The belongings were not of significant material value. They were the kind of objects that matter, because they have been present in a life for a long time and carry the weight of that presence. The soldiers did not know this. They could not have known it. They helped anyway with the same focus and care they would have given to something of obvious importance. And when they were done, they did not leave, but asked through gestures in the translation devices whether there was anything else that needed moving. There was always anything else that needed moving. They stayed. I thought about what it would have meant for the Valara to respond this way to a call for help from a species they had no prior connection to. On the other side of deep space, with no strategic justification, I tried to hold this thought honestly. I concluded that we would have discussed it at length. We would have weighed the costs and the political implications and the risks of setting a precedent. We might eventually have decided to help. The decision would have taken time that the situation in question would not have had. Humans did not discuss it. They moved and discussed later, if at all. I do not know whether this is admirable or reckless. I know that a world is still inhabited because of it, and that seems like the most relevant data point available. I want to say one more thing before I close this account. On the fourth day after the battle, when the immediate work of rescue and stabilization was mostly complete, and the human medical teams were shifting from emergency response to longer-term support, I sought out Dr. Mercer. She was in the temporary treatment facility the humans had established in the southern plaza. Reviewing patient records on a device I did not recognize, looking the way people look when they are tired, but have not yet given themselves permission to acknowledge it. I asked her through the translation device, a question that I had been carrying for several days. "Why did you come?" She looked at me for a moment. She was not, I thought, surprised by the question. She had probably been asked it before by other Valara in those days. She thought about her answer carefully, which I appreciated because it suggested she was taking the question seriously rather than offering a rehearsed response. "Someone needed help," she said. Finally, we had the ability to help, so we came. I told her that I had heard this answer before from Admiral Harmon. She nodded as if this was not surprising to her. "It is the same answer because it is the only true answer," she said. "There is not a longer version of it." I have thought about this for a long time. I believe she was telling me something important about the difference between a policy and a nature. A policy is a decision that a civilization makes in response to a situation, something that can be revised, debated, overturned. A nature is something else. It is what a thing does because of what it is, not because of what it decided. I came away from this thinking that humanity's response to our distress signal was not a policy decision. It was in nature expressing itself in the circumstances that called for it. The Admiral's answer and the doctor's answer were the same answer because they were describing the same thing from different positions within it. Our archivists had placed humans in the minor category of galactic civilizations based on territory and fleet size. This is a reasonable metric by the standards we have always used. It misses something important. I am beginning to think the standards need revision. My name is still Maraus, and I'm still at Relay Station Kepler 9. I have been here for 14 months since the night I forwarded the Valara distress signal. I have been offered 3 transfers and turned them all down, which my supervisors find puzzling and my colleagues find either admirable or inexplicable depending on who you ask. I stay because I know this station. I know its rhythms. I know exactly the groan the water recycler makes when it needs a filter change. I know which console display runs 5 seconds behind real time if you do not manually refresh it. I know how the stars look from the east-facing viewport at 0400. When the rotation of the rock we are bolted to brings them into an arrangement that is genuinely beautiful in the quiet, enormous way that space is beautiful when you give it your full attention. I stay because this is where the signals arrive first. The traffic through this station has changed significantly. We used to handle maybe 40 signals per shift cycle, mostly navigation pings and standard communication relays. The count now runs between 800 and 1200 per shift. A significant portion of that increase falls into a logging category I created 6 months ago that I call distress adjacent, which is for signals that are not formally coded as distress calls, but are clearly originating from ships or populations that are in some kind of difficulty and are trying to reach someone. I sent a formal inquiry to Central Command about this pattern 6 months ago. The response came from an analyst named Ben Harker, who told me in careful language that several species in this sector had quietly begun routing their emergency communication traffic through human relay infrastructure. Not through any formal agreement, not with any public announcement, just quietly. The way things happen when someone discovers that a particular route works and begins using it. Ben included one detail I have thought about many times since. He told me that 2 of the species now routing through our network were among those that had filed formal protests after the Valara incident. They had issued public statements condemning human unilateral military action. They had supported the Conclave censure motions against us, and then privately, with no announcement, they had started sending their emergency traffic through our systems. I do not find this contradictory. I think I understand it. What you say in a formal political setting and what you do when you actually need someone are not always the same thing. The Conclave has formally condemned human actions in the Valara system 3 times in the past 14 months. The Syndicate has imposed new trade restrictions. The Craft Dominion has issued a species-level threat designation against humanity, which authorizes any craft vessel to treat any human vessel as a legitimate target. Government analysts have written reports about all of this. Our military has noted the craft threat designation, increased patrol density, and continued with its readiness posture. The fleet that came home from Valara received a welcome that I was not present for, but that I have watched the recorded footage of more times than I can count. 214. People did not come home. I know that number in the way you know certain numbers without looking them up, without needing to. 214. I have spent time in the records going through what is publicly available, learning names, learning postings, learning the small details that are preserved in personnel files and that give you partial pictures of complete people. I do not know all of them well. I know some of them the way you know a sketch rather than a full portrait, but I know their names. I read them aloud on the anniversary. Alone in the main room at 03 Station quiet, the stars visible in the viewport. Owen Price, who has been reassigned to a posting closer to home, but was on comms with me that night from wherever he was, read the names with me. We did not talk much beyond that. We sat in the quiet for a while afterward. The way you sit with something that does not need more words added to it. Dr. Lucy Mercer found me 4 months after the battle through the duty logs, traced the routing signature on the Priority 1 flag I had attached to the signal. Her message was short. She told me the lower city of Valara Prime was still standing. She told me the structural repairs were mostly complete. She told me that the Valara Elder Speaker, who had approached her team on the first day, had sent a message to the medical unit that she thought I might want to hear a part of. She included a few translated lines from Elder Speaker Sur. The line said that when the medical team arrived, the elder speaker had been standing on a rooftop, preparing herself for what came next, and that watching the humans work had changed something in her understanding of what the galaxy was, and that she was still working out what to do with the change. I saved that message in the same folder where I keep Admiral Harmon's forward note from the first night. The political situation, according to the analysis papers I follow, has become complicated in ways that the major powers apparently did not anticipate. The structure of galactic power in this region had been stable for roughly 150 years, maintained through a combination of formal agreements, older understandings, and a shared reluctance to disrupt something that was working well enough. What humanity did at Valara did not fit into that structure. We had not seized territory. We had not made demands. We had not built a strategic position or claimed any advantage. We had responded to a signal, removed a threat, provided medical assistance, and gone home. This turned out to be more disruptive to the existing structure than an act of conventional aggression. Would have been because the existing structure had protocols for aggression. It had escalation frameworks and diplomatic channels designed specifically to manage it. What it did not have was any framework for a species that intervened in a distant conflict purely because someone asked for help, and they had the ability to answer. I am told there are active debates in the conclave right now about whether to formally classify humanity's behavior pattern as a new legal category, something between ally and emergency service, a designation that has no precedent because until recently there was no need for it. I find this quietly remarkable that 14 months ago, the most significant thing I had ever done at this posting was correctly route a navigation ping. And now conclave lawyers are debating whether humans require their own legal classification because of something that started with me forwarding a signal at 0217. I think about the station traffic, 800 to 200 signals per cycle rising species that publicly object to our methods, while privately trusting our response. I think about what that means, about the gap between what you say is acceptable and what you reach for when you actually need someone in the dark. I think about the elder speaker on her rooftop. I think about Alice Dunn with her arm wrapped watching pressure gauges. I think about 214 names that I know without looking them up. The night shift is quiet tonight. Carl Webb, who replaced Owen Price at this station, is thorough and careful and has good instincts for unusual signal patterns, which is exactly what you want in a relay technician. He brought me coffee 20 minutes ago without being asked, which means he is already learning how this station works. At 021 local time, 3 minutes before the first anniversary of the Valara signal, my console lit up. Carl sat straight in his chair. I was already moving. The signal came from an independent colony transport called the Meridian Cross, registered out of the Carthus system. They had encountered a gravitational shear anomaly at the edge of a brown dwarf system, a feature that was not on any current charts because the local mass distribution shifts unpredictably in this category of stellar body. The shear had damaged their primary structural integrity field. Secondary systems were holding but degrading. Their engineer, Dana Halt, had written in the distress header that structural failure would become unreoverable within 72 hours. 712 people aboard. Carl looked at me with the expression of someone new enough to the job that he is still reading the senior person in the room to understand what happens next. I flagged the signal priority 1 and opened the channel to Central Command. Admiral Harmon picked up in 2 minutes, not 42, which told me the same way it had told me 14 months ago, that something was already moving before I called. Whether she kept irregular hours now, or whether the network that had grown up around our relay station meant there were more people watching more channels than there used to be, I did not know. What I knew was that 2 minutes was faster than 4. "Voss," she said. "Admiral, Colony transport, 712 souls. Structural failure progressing. 72 hours to unreoverable. Transmitting full data now. I heard the familiar sounds typing. A voice in the background already pulling numbers. Anything else in that system? No other vessels within rescue range. Admiral, we are the closest relay with a clear line. 2 seconds. Where do we need to be? And there it was. The same words as the first time, or close enough. Not, is this worth it? Not, what will the conclave say? Not let me consult the appropriate authority. Just where? Somewhere out in the dark, things were beginning to move again. Carl was watching me with an expression that had shifted from waiting to understanding. The specific look of a person who is seeing something clearly for the first time and will carry that clarity forward. I pulled up the mobilization tracking screen. I started doing my job. 712 people were in a failing ship in the dark, and they did not know yet that a signal had been sent and answered. Dana Hall was watching her structural readings and running calculations and making the kind of peace that engineers make when the numbers are telling them something they do not want to hear. She did not know yet that her distress header had reached a relay station staffed by a person who had long since stopped asking whether to forward a signal like that. The screen began to fill with movement confirmations. Ships redirecting crews, waking the same shape assembling that had assembled once before. Smaller this time. Faster. Because certain things had become smoother with practice. This is not a policy. It has never been a policy. It is something that does not have a clean name in any language I know. Something that operates underneath strategy and political calculation and rational cost-benefit analysis. It is older than all of those things. It moves before the thinking catches up. The galaxy had looked at humans for a long time and seen a species of modest territory and limited reach, and had placed us reasonably enough in the lower tier of civilizations that required serious attention. The galaxy had assumed that when a distress signal arrived at a human relay station, the result would be the same as when it arrived anywhere else. A log entry, a referral, a sincere and formal expression of regret. What the galaxy had not understood, and what it was now beginning to understand with the slow and slightly uncomfortable quality of a lesson that changes how you see things, is that you cannot predict what humans will do by measuring what we have. You have to look at what we do when someone calls out in the dark and there is no one else. There is almost never anyone else. This is not a special circumstance. This is most nights, most shifts, most signals. This is the ordinary condition of the galaxy, which is full of things going wrong and short on things moving toward them. We move toward them. Carl is routing support data to the incoming channel. The water recycler groans in the corridor. The stars sit in the viewport the way they always sit, cold and distant and not paying attention to anything in particular. I got a message from Admiral Harmon on the 6-month anniversary of the Valara operation. Not a formal communique through the chain of command. A personal message sent directly, the kind that flags itself as informal correspondence. It was longer than her previous forward note. She told me that she had been asked many times in the 6 months since the operation to explain the decision-making process that led to Protocol Omega being activated in response to my forwarded signal. She told me she had answered this question for government oversight bodies, for conclave inquiries, for journalists, for her own command review board. She said that in every case she had given the same answer, which was that she had looked at the situation and made the decision that the situation required. The oversight bodies and the review boards and the journalists had all wanted more than this. They had wanted a framework, a policy, a set of conditions that had been met and evaluated. She had told them each time that she did not have a more detailed answer to give them, because the more detailed answer would have been invented after the fact to satisfy the desire for a framework that had not been the actual basis of the decision. She ended the message by saying that she wanted me to know that the decision had been the right one and that she would make it again in the same circumstances, and that she considered the forwarding of that signal by a staff sergeant on a quiet night shift to be one of the best pieces of work that had come through her command in 20 years. I read this message 3 times. Then I saved it in the same folder as the forward note and the message from Dr. Mercer. I have a folder in my personal that now contains a small number of documents that I return to sometimes. Not because they require review, but because they are the kind of thing that benefits from being a reread when enough time has passed to seize them from a slightly different angle. The forward note, the message from Dr. Mercer, the Admiral's longer message, a photograph that Owen Price sent me from the Valara homeworld, taken during the support period after the battle, showing the main plaza of the lower city with the temporary medical facility still standing in the middle of it, and a group of Valara and humans standing together in the way that people stand when a photograph is being taken, and they do not know quite what to do with their hands. I look at that photograph sometimes on the night shift. I think about what it to get those people into the same place at the same time. The years of engineering. The engineering decisions that pushed drives past their rated limits. The 2 engineers who took burns on a slick panel. The Marines who did something that had never been done before and would be written about in military history studies for the next H100 red years. The 2 Marines who did not come home. The distance between a distress signal arriving at a relay station and a group of people standing together in a plaza on a world that is still there. I think about the conclave's ongoing debates about what legal category to assign to humanity's pattern of behavior. I heard recently through the kind of informal network that relay station staff develop with each other over time that the debates have expanded to include a proposal for a formal interstellar emergency response framework that would codify certain obligations for response to distress signals across the major powers. The proposal is controversial. It is being opposed by several powers who view it as a constraint on their political autonomy. It is being supported by a surprising number of smaller species who have been watching what happened at Valara and drawing their own conclusions. I do not know whether the framework will pass. I do not know what it would change in practical terms if it did. What I know is that the debate is happening because something demonstrated in a way that was very difficult to ignore, that a distress signal from a species in danger could be answered and answered in time by people who decided that the answer was the only possible response. I know that this is going to be studied and argued about in political and legal and academic settings for a very long time. I find this interesting and not particularly relevant to what I do on any given night shift. The night shift is quiet tonight. Carl Webb is at his station monitoring the traffic with the focused patience, who has been doing this long enough to know the difference between routine anomalies and things that require a different kind of attention. He brought me coffee. The water recycler groaned. The stars are in the viewport. At 02 Faltour local time, 3 minutes before the first anniversary of the Valara signal, my console lit up. Carl sat straight. I was already moving. The signal was from an independent colony transport called the Meridian Cross. Registry out of the Carthus system. Gravitational shear anomaly. Structural integrity failing. 72 hours. 712 people aboard. Carl looked at me with the expression of someone who is new enough to this that they are still learning what the senior person in the room does when something like this arrives. I flagged it Priority 1. I opened the channel to Central Command. Admiral Harmon picked up in 2 minutes. I have thought about that 2-minute response time in the days since that shift. I think it means that she or someone in her command maintains a readiness condition that I was not aware of. A state of preparedness for exactly this kind of call that allows for a faster response than the operational normal. I think it means that the 4 minutes it had taken 14 months ago was the time it took to get from sleep to full awareness and to the console. 2 minutes means someone is already at the console. Someone is already watching. I think about the species that have quietly begun routing their emergency traffic through our relay network. I think about the 800 to 200 signals per cycle that now move through this station, compared to the 40 that used to. I think about the fact that this station, which was built and staffed as a routine deep space communications relay, has become something else over the past 14 months. Not through any policy decision or official redesignation, but simply because started coming here and we kept answering them. The galaxy does not have a name for what we are in this particular function. The conclave lawyers are trying to create one. I think the name when it arrives will be something precise and formal that will miss the actual quality of the thing the way that formal names for informal realities often do. The actual quality of the thing is simpler and older than any legal framework. Someone calls. We answer. We go. Admiral Harmon's voice on the channel. Voss Admiral Colony Transport 7 and 12 structural failure in progress. 72 hours remaining. Full data transmitting now. The sounds of her working. Another voice in the background already moving toward the relevant information. The shape of what comes next, forming in the space between us across the light years of signal in the 2 minutes it takes between a distress call arriving and the first pieces of a response beginning to assemble. Where do we need to be? The mobilization screen is filling up. Carl is routing support data with the focus of someone who understands now what this work is. Outside the viewport, the stars are the same as they always are. 712 people are in a failing ship in the dark and do not know yet that the waiting is almost over. Dana Halt is watching her structural readings and doing the math that engineers do when the math is pointing somewhere they do not want to go. She does not know yet that 3 minutes ago a signal she sent reached a station, staffed by a person who has long since stopped asking the question of whether to forward something like this. There is no question. There has not been a question for a long time. This is not a policy. It has never been a policy. Policies are things that civilizations decide. This is something that exists before the decision underneath it, older than the frameworks that people build to describe it. It is the thing that moved before Admiral Harmon had finished waking up. It is the thing that made Alice Dunn go back to her station with her arm wrapped. It is the thing that made a Marine in the rubble of a collapsing city sit down next to a frightened child and stay. The galaxy had looked at humans for a long time and placed us in categories based on what we had, and the categories were reasonable, and the placement was fair by the standards of measurement the galaxy had been using. What the galaxy had not measured, because it had no instrument for measuring it, was what we do when someone is in the dark and calls out, and we are the ones who hear. We go toward it. This is what we do. The mobilization screen shows ships moving. We are already on our dough.